Chapter 1. The Bells of Marly-Combe-les-Beaux was the kind of village that seemed to drift just slightly outside of time. Tucked between soft green hills and surrounded by thick woodland, it rested beside the mysterious dark stretch of water, known to locals only as Blackmere Lake, or more superstitiously, the lake with no bottom. The name was a bit of folklore, of course, but even the most modern villagers would lower their voices when speaking of it, especially at night. Strange echoes came off that water. Lights were sometimes seen, and no one ever swam in it. Not since 1972, when the cart of old Billy Sutton had rolled into it during the May Day fair and vanished without so much as a ripple. That was the sort of story Marly-Combe liked. The kind that no one quite believed, yet everyone quietly respected. The surface, the village was tidy and cheerful. It had its local pub, the Stag's Whisper, with low beams and good ale, a post office where gossip changed hands faster than letters, and a church whose bells could be heard for miles on. Clear mornings. And that's where everything began. With the bells dot, it was Sunday, and the villagers had gathered for the morning service at St. Peter's. Old Mr. Worthing, the bell ringer, hadn't shown up, which was unusual. He was 86 and nearly. Deaf, but punctual as sunrise. They'd waited a few minutes. Then 10, then 20. Reverend Elton had started the service without him, but when the service ended and young Rosie Trent, a choir girl with a fondness for sneaking up to the bell tower, climbed the narrow spiral stairs to look for her misplaced songbook. She saw something that made her freeze. There, slumped awkwardly against the wooden wall of the tower, was Mr. Worthing, his face pale, his eyes wide open, and one hand stretched toward the brass bell rope that hung still and motionless in the air. The songbook fell from Rosie's fingers and landed with a thud that echoed through the yell. Church dot by the time Constable Rigby had been fetched from his breakfast at the Stag's Whisper. Half the village had gathered outside St. Peter's. A few. Children had climbed the lich gate for a better view. Mothers hissed at them to get down, but their voices were faint, distracted. Something dark had slipped into the calm routine of Marly-Combe, like an oil stain on a linen cloth. "He's dead," Rigby muttered, coming down from the bell tower a few minutes later. He was a kind man, but not the sharpest tool in the shed. No sign of struggle. Looks like his heart gave out. Rosie, still pale, stood with her arms crossed tight over her chest. He looked scared. His eyes. He looked scared. "People look strange when they die, miss," Rigby said, but his voice was uncertain. It might have ended there. It might have been a sad, natural passing, a respected old man who had simply gone the way of all things. But something about it itched at the minds of the villagers. Why hadn't the bell rung? Mr. Worthing had come to ring it. He had his hand on the rope, yet there was no sound that morning. Not a chime. By nightfall, the theories began to spread. Maybe someone was with him, whispered Mabel Crane, whose voice carried better than most rumors. "I heard he had enemies," said the grocer, looking pleased to finally say something dramatic in his dull life. "He never liked the lake," someone else muttered. "Always said it knew things." 2 days later, the official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, and the village would have slowly moved on, if not for what happened next. The vicar's dog, a friendly golden retriever named Rufus, went missing, and when the poor beast was finally found, tangled in brambles down near the lakeshore, there was something tied to his collar, a small piece of bell rope. Frayed and stained with something reddish-brown. Suddenly, the talk wasn't about old age or heart failure. It was about secrets and fear. And death. It was about the lake. And into this quietly unraveling world. 2 days after the dog, and 4 days after the bells had fallen silent, came a man with a soft southern drawl, a white linen suit, and eyes that missed nothing. Benoit Blanc stepped off the train at Marly-Combe Station, with a modest bag in hand, nodded politely to the station master, and paused to look up at the sky. The clouds were low and gray. Rain was coming. Perfect, he murmured to himself. Rain always brings the truth up through the cracks. He had received no formal invitation. He never did. Just a letter, unsigned, and a line apiece. Bottom. Come see the lake with no bottom. One soul has drowned in silence. More may follow. Blanc folded the letter back into his coat, straightened his tie, and began to walk. Marleycombe, with its quiet lanes and prim gardens, was not ready for what he would uncover. Not yet. Chapter 2. The Whisper in the Water. The villagers of Marleycombe were a courteous lot by nature, but they regarded strangers the way old cats do new furniture, with wary circling and sniffing at a distance. So when Benoit Blanc arrived at the Stag's Whisper, umbrella dripping, a handful of regulars looked up from their afternoon pints with guarded interest. He removed his hat, nodded to no one in particular, and took a seat by the fireplace, where a small flame struggled to stay alive in the July damp. Behind the bar, a stout man with a red face and tight sleeves wiped a glass half-heartedly. "You'll be wanting a room, then?" he asked. "I believe that's customary," Blanc replied with an easy smile. "When one comes from a long way." "On short notice," the man squinted. "We're not really a tourist spot, sir." "Neither am I," Blanc said. He did not offer his name. Not yet. The next hour passed in quiet observation. Blanc sipped his tea slowly. Around him, the pub buzzed with murmured theories. He caught the names: Worthing, the dog, the lake. Each word floated through the air like smoke from a pipe. One man leaned in toward his companion. "It was his heart," they said. "But did you see the body?" Eyes wide open like he'd seen the devil. "Aye, and what about the rope?" the other replied. "Frayed. Looked like it was cut." The barmaid, a young woman named Nina Partridge, brought Blanc another cup without him asking. "You're?" "Not from around here," she said. Not a question. "An invitation." "No, ma'am," he said, "but I was asked to come." "Family of Mr. Worthing?" "Nothing so personal, just curious about the bell that never rang." That caught her off guard. She blinked once, then glanced behind her as if someone might be listening. People don't talk about the bell. Not directly. Yet they talk about it constantly, Blanc said, just not to the right person. Nina hesitated, then leaned in a little. "If you're here asking questions, best you speak to Reverend Elton. He's the one who found the note." Blanc raised a brow. "What note?" "The one someone left on the church door, the day after Mr. Worthing died. It was just one line." "What did it say?" She hesitated. "He died for silence." "That's all." Blanc was silent for a moment, and he nodded slowly. "That's not a warning," he murmured. "That's a message." He rose and left a tip so generous it made Nina gasp. By the time he stepped out into the evening mist, word had already begun to spread. A man with a strange accent was asking questions. At the vicarage, Reverend Philip Elton lived in a modest red-brick vicarage beside the graveyard. His garden was orderly, if a bit overgrown at the corners, and the curtains in the windows were always drawn just slightly, enough to see out without being seen. He was in his late 50s, mild-mannered, with kind eyes and a permanently furrowed brow that made him look constantly concerned, even when saying something cheerful. He welcomed Blanc with a polite smile and ushered him into a sitting room lined with theological books and the lingering scent of pipe smoke. "You must be the detective," he said gently. "Or should I say, the philosopher who solves murders." Blanc chuckled. "I'll take either, Reverend." Elton poured them both some sherry. He did not ask how Blanc had known to come. The letter, it seemed, was enough of an explanation. "I did find a note," the vicar confirmed, "pinned to the church door with an old nail. It was unsettling." May, I see it. The vicar opened a small drawer and removed a folded scrap of yellow paper. Blanc took it carefully. The handwriting was cramped, aggressive. The message, just as Nina had said. He died for silence. Blanc studied the paper and held it to the light. Torn from a sermon sheet, I think, he said, and written with a fountain pen. Blue-black ink. You can tell all that? The vicar asked, impressed. I can tell much more, Blanc said, eyes narrowing. But only if I understand the man who died. Tell me about Mr. Worthing. Elton sighed. Thomas Worthing was old-fashioned, kept to his routine, lived alone, out near the woods, walked to the bell tower every Sunday, and never missed a service. He'd been here since before I arrived. I think he liked being the one constant. Did he have enemies? None that I knew of. But then, the kind of anger that leads to murder isn't always loud. Sometimes it simmers for decades. Blanc nodded. Did he ever speak of the lake? Elton hesitated. Once, years ago, he said it had witnessed something foul. I asked what he meant, but he changed the subject. Blanc sipped his sherry and stood. Would you take me to his cottage? Now? The light's fading, Blanc said. And sometimes that's when things are easiest to see. A cottage in the trees missed her. Worthing's cottage sat on the edge of Marleycombe Wood, just a 10-minute walk from the church. It was a tidy little place, locked and untouched since his death. The vicar had the spare key. Inside, the air was dry and still. Old clock, older chair, neatly folded blankets, a cupboard of mismatched china. Blanc moved through the space like a man reading a poem in an unfamiliar language. He didn't disturb anything. Just observed. Then he stopped. On the mantel was a faded photograph in a wooden frame. A young Thomas Worthing beside a woman, stern-faced, sharp eyes. She had been crossed out with ink. Viciously, Blanc picked it up. Do you know who this is? The vicar peered over his shoulder. No. I thought he had no family. Then why keep her picture and mark her out? He put the photo back and moved toward the writing desk. In a drawer, beneath a layer of yellowed envelopes, he found a page torn from a diary. The words were scribbled in haste, smudged at the edges. I know what happened that summer. She made me swear, but I can't die with it. Benoit Blanc's eyes narrowed. He was going to confess something. He murmured. Elton looked unsettled. Do you think someone stopped him before he could? I think, Blanc said softly, that Marleycombe has buried more than memories. From outside, a low wind rose through the trees, and somewhere, far off, a ripple broke the surface of Blackmere Lake. Chapter 3. The girl who knew too much. The next morning, Marleycombe woke under a thick blanket of fog. It rolled in from the lake like a living thing, curling around hedges and fence posts, swallowing trees at the edge of vision. The village looked smaller in the haze, and quieter, as if it were holding its breath. Benoit Blanc rose early. He liked the fog. It made people speak softer and listen harder. He stood at the edge of Blackmere Lake, his coat collar turned up, watching the water. It did not move, not even a ripple. He'd seen mountain lakes, saltwater inlets, and deep Louisiana swamps, but something about Blackmere was different. It felt unnatural, not in the way of ghosts or curses, but in a way that suggested people had done something to it, something terrible. A voice cut through the mist. You're him, aren't you? The man they wrote to. Blanc turned. A girl stood 10 feet away on the mossy path, wearing a red hoodie and wellies 2 sizes too big. Her hair was dark and braided down her back. She looked about 15, maybe 16, but her eyes were older than that. Sharp, clever, and watchful. I might be, Blanc said gently. Who are you? Nellie Barnes, she said. My gran used to clean for Mr. Worthing before she got sick. Blank nodded. I'm sorry to hear that. She said he talked in his sleep, that he'd mutter names she didn't recognize, that sometimes he'd cry. Blanc's gaze sharpened. Did she ever write anything down? Nellie hesitated. Then she pulled something from her coat pocket, an old notepad, the corners curled from use. Gran gave this to me before she passed. Said if something ever happened to Mr. Worthing, I should give it to someone who listens with both ears. Blank smiled softly. Your gran had good judgment. He flipped through the pages, stopping at one scribbled entry in faint pencil. Thomas muttered again. Same name. Eleanor. Always after thunder. Sometimes says, I saw her fall. We buried her twice. Blank paused. Eleanor. That mean something? Nellie asked. It means Mr. Worthing knew something about a woman who disappeared? Died? He looked up. Do you know anyone named Eleanor? Nellie shook her head. Not here. Not my age group anyway. But the old ones, they never talk about the past. My gran said Marley Comb's full of secrets, just buried. Under politeness, Blank handed back the notepad. You should keep this safe. Nellie tucked it back into her hoodie. You're not like the police, she said. They don't listen. They just decide. No, Blank agreed. I listen to the quiet things, the tremble in a hand, the way someone stares too long at a photograph. The lie told not in words, but in timing. Nellie's eyes glinted. Then you're going to find out what happened, aren't you? I? Already am he, said Dot at the station. Constable Rigby had the look of a man trying very hard to appear in control of a situation already far beyond his depth. When Blank arrived at the small police station, the constable offered him lukewarm tea and a thin smile. I hear you've been asking around, Rigby said, only where ears are open and mouths too eager. The constable cleared his throat. Look, Mr. Blank, we've ruled the death natural. Nothing on the body to suggest otherwise. No bruises, no broken bones. I'm aware, Blank said. But tell me, have you ever seen a man die with his hand stretched toward a rope without making a sound? Rigby blinked. Well, no, but old people freeze sometimes. They do. But did you know Mr. Worthing was seen buying oil for the bell mechanism 2 days before he died? Rigby frowned. No, but maybe he was just keeping up his duties. Blank nodded. A man keeps up his duties, prepares his Sunday clothes, tends his bell, and dies before ringing it. He placed a small photograph on the desk, the one of Worthing with the woman, inked out. Do you know her? Rigby leaned in. That's from decades ago, isn't it? Old, yes. But anger doesn't age. Who was she? Rigby tapped his pen nervously. There used to be a woman named Eleanor Marsh, who lived here in the 70s. Teacher at the school. Pretty. Fierce. Disappeared one summer. People said she ran off with a man from London, but there were whispers. What kind of whispers? Rigby shifted in his seat. That she was pregnant. That someone in the village didn't want her to keep the baby. But no one ever proved anything. Blank sat back, fingers steepled. And where did she live? Cottage at the edge of the lake, Rigby said quietly. But it burned down. No one rebuilt. Of course not, Blank murmured. Let the water take it. The second deathly fog began to lift by late afternoon. Marley Combe stretched, exhaled, and screamed. A jogger, pale and trembling, had stumbled into the village square from the trail behind the woods. He couldn't speak, just pointed. They followed him, a small crowd growing with each step until they reached the lake path. There, not far from where Blank had spoken to Nellie, lay the body of a man, face down, cold. Still. Constable Rigby. Paled. That's Graham Linton, local historian. Used to help archive church records. Nina arrived, clutching her apron and panting. He was in here last night. Said something about an old ledger. Looked rattled. Said he saw a name he shouldn't have. Blanc crouched by the body. No blood, no wounds. Just a scrap of paper, pinned to the man's sleeve with a rusty tack dot one line. He read what he shouldn't have. Now he's in the lake, too. Rigby looked ill. But he's not in the lake. Blanc stood. No, but whoever wrote that wants us thinking about what's under it. He turned to the crowd, who had begun to gather again in nervous murmurs. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, voice calm and clear. We are no longer dealing with whispers. We are standing in the path of something long buried, and quite determined to stay that way. Chapter 4. The ledger in the crypt train came down in waves that night. Heavy, driving, relentless. It lashed against Marleycomb's windows and turned its narrow lanes into muddy rivulets. But inside the vicarage, beneath the yellow light of a flickering lamp, Benoit Blanc and Reverend Elton stood over a damp-stained leather book retrieved from the church's crypt, a parish ledger from 1972. The year Eleanor Marsh disappeared. This, said Elton, gently brushing away flakes of mildew, is what Graham Linton was reading the night before he died? Blanc nodded. And likely why he's dead now. They had found the ledger wrapped in oilcloth behind a false panel in the church crypt, precisely where Nina had overheard Linton say he'd spotted it. Hours before his death, Blanc opened it. The paper crackled. Names, dates, baptisms, funerals, all penned in careful looping script. He flipped to the summer pages of 1972 and scanned them slowly. Then he paused. There, in faded brown ink, were two entries only days apart. June 3rd, 1972. Funeral of Eleanor Marsh. No family present. Service performed by Rev. J. Cantwell. Body not interred in church grounds. June 5th, 1972. Burial service. Unknown child. Estimated gestation 7 months. No mother listed. Grave unmarked. Witnesses. Worthing, T. Linton, M. Reverend Elton. Paled. Good Lord, they buried her. And a child, Blanc murmured, tracing the line with his finger. And didn't mark the graves. Elton whispered, but Eleanor Marsh was never officially declared dead. No obituary. No family came. She had no one, Blanc said. Except, it seems, the men who helped bury her. He tapped the second name. Linton. Michael Linton. Graham's father. The Reverend looked shaken. So Graham found out his own father had helped cover up, Blanc nodded, and told someone, maybe to confront them, maybe to dig deeper. Instead, he ended up dead, but not in the lake. Just near it, a warning. Blanc looked up. A very deliberate one. Down by the Black Mary the next morning, the storm had passed, but the air hung heavy with the scent of wet leaves and peat. The lake was still again, but the fog hadn't returned. It felt raw. Exposed. Blanc returned to the shore with Nellie Barnes, who had insisted on coming. You sure this is where he died? She asked, pulling her hoodie tighter around her. Yes, Blanc said, crouching beside the flattened grass, and the chalk outline the constable had scrawled in the dirt. But it's not where he was killed. Nellie frowned. What do you mean? Blanc plucked a thin, broken twig from the soil. There are drag marks. Someone brought the body here, feet first. Nellie narrowed her eyes. But why not? Just dump him in the lake like the note said? Because that would have made it too easy. Whoever did this wants to control the story, not erase it. Fear works better when it's public. They stood in silence for a moment, and Nellie said, I heard my gran once say that after Eleanor disappeared, a few people stopped coming to church. Just ... disappeared themselves. One moved away overnight. Another supposedly drowned. She Said it was the lake's way of punishing those who talked. Blank looked at her. Who drowned? Walter Pym, local schoolteacher. Gran said he was close to Eleanor. Maybe too close. Blank considered this. So Eleanor disappears. A child is buried. Pym vanishes. And now, 50 years later, the last witnesses are being silenced. But why now? Nellie asked. Why after all these years? Blank looked toward the horizon. Because someone's dying, or scared, or maybe someone's writing their own ending before time does it for them. The third clue back at the Stag's Whisper, Nina was waiting behind the bar with something wrapped in a dish towel. This came in this morning, she said, placing it before Blank. No postmark, just left on the doorstep. Inside was a book, a worn paperback edition of The Hound of the Baskervilles. Folded inside its cover was another piece of paper. This time, the handwriting was shaky, different from the previous notes, and blotched with ink. One corner had been torn and chewed as if by a rat or nervous hands. There are 3, you know. 2 are dead. The last lives where the water touches the trees. Blank read it twice. Then a slow, grim smile touched his face. The killer is playing. A game, he said. They want me to know there's one more witness, but they've hidden him, somewhere near the lake. Nellie whispered, We need to find them first. We do, Blank said, before the lake takes them too. A silent house by dusk, they were there. A small timber-framed house partially collapsed into itself, hidden deep in the woods along the north curve of Blackmere Lake. Vines had overtaken most of it, but there was smoke coming from a crooked chimney. A sign dangled on rusted hinges. Hawthorne Hollow, keep out. Blank and Nellie approached slowly. An old woman sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, her gray hair long and unbrushed, her eyes sharp as broken glass. She looked at them without surprise. I was wondering when you'd come, she said. Blank stepped forward. You're the last one, aren't you? She nodded. The only one who still remembers everything and isn't afraid to say it. Then you must speak, Blank said gently, before it's too late. The woman exhaled, a long, trembling breath. I saw her fall, she said, and I saw what they did after. The lake isn't cursed. It's just where we put our shame. Chapter 5. The Woman in Hawthorne Hollow. The interior of Hawthorne Hollow smelled of damp wool, wood smoke, and something floral, but faded, like pressed lavender gone musty with time. Benoit Blanc stepped lightly over the crooked threshold, followed by Nellie, who clutched her notebook tighter now, as if it were armor. The woman who'd greeted them was seated again, motionless in a wooden chair, patched with mismatched cushions. She stared into the fire, as if watching a story replay in the flames. My name, she said without looking at them, is Margaret Veal. Once, I was Eleanor's closest friend. Blank took a slow seat across from her. You knew her well? I knew her when she still smiled, before Marleycone stole her voice and buried her name. She turned to him now. You've heard about the baby? I've read what's left of the record. A funeral, an unmarked grave, witnesses who never spoke of it again. Margaret's mouth thinned. They didn't speak because they were told not to. Eleanor had secrets, yes, but the village had worse ones. Nellie spoke for the first time. What happened to her? Margaret didn't answer immediately. She turned her head toward the blackened window, as if weighing the risk of remembering aloud. It was 1972. Eleanor was teaching at the school, sharp as a whip and beautiful in a way that made some of the men nervous, especially the married ones. She had ideas, wrote letters to the paper, spoke her mind, not very. Marleycone, if you understand. Blank nodded slowly. She was involved with someone, Margaret continued, secretly. A man with a name that still gives this village indigestion. Malcolm. Linton. Graham Linton's grandfather? Blank asked. No, his father. There was a moment of stunned silence. Even Nellie's pen paused. Margaret continued. Malcolm was much older, a member of the parish council. Eleanor believed. He loved her. But when she became pregnant, everything changed. He told her to go away quietly. She refused. Did anyone else know? Some suspected. Worthing certainly knew. So did Walter Pym. But it was Malcolm who acted first. I don't know exactly how. All I know is that one evening she came to me, shaking, crying, saying she'd been pushed, but not from a cliff, from a choice. Either she leave, or they'd make sure she disappeared. Blanc's voice dropped. And she did, Margaret nodded. She vanished 3 days later. They claimed she ran off to London. But I knew better. She paused. I went to the lake. And I saw the lights. Blanc's gaze sharpened. Lights? They were burying something, Margaret whispered. At the far edge, just where the trees begin to root into the marsh. I couldn't see who it was, only the lantern. And the shape. Long, wrapped in something dark. Did you tell the police? I told the vicar, the old one. He told me to keep quiet. For my safety. And you listened? Margaret's eyes blazed suddenly. I was 17 and poor and alone. They scared me. And when the house I grew up in burned to the ground that winter, they all said it was an accident. I didn't think so. Blank looked at Nellie. Another fire. Like Eleanor's cottage. Exactly, Margaret said. They erased her. Then they erased me. The secret grave by mid-afternoon. The three of them stood at the far edge of the lake, near a hollowed tree split by lightning decades ago. Margaret, slower now, pointed with a trembling hand. There, she said, under the stone with no markings. I remember that much. Nellie knelt first, brushing away years of moss and grit. It wasn't much, just a slab of flat slate tucked between the roots. But there was no mistaking it now. Blank crouched and ran a hand along the edge. This was placed here deliberately. Weighted deep. Margaret stood back. There were 2 burials, I was told. One for Eleanor. One for the child. But they never told me where. I assumed this was one of them. Blank rose, brushing earth from his fingers. Then it's time someone told the truth. The real suspect emerges later that evening, as the rain returned in a soft whisper over the rooftops. Blank visited Constable Rigby. I need the original witness statements from 1972, he said. Rigby blinked. They were never filed properly. Just hearsay. Besides, most involved are dead. Not all, Blank said. Margaret Veal is very much alive, and so is the son of Malcolm Linton. Rigby stiffened. You think Graham? No. Blank interrupted softly. Graham tried to expose the truth. And died for it. Then who? Blank tapped the photograph he had laid on Rigby's desk. A scan of the 1972 Parish Council photo. In the back, wearing a dark suit and faint smirk, stood Martin Linton, age 20. He's not just the son of Malcolm, Blank said. He's the man who inherited his father's sins, and perhaps chose to protect them at any cost. But he's lived here all his life, Rigby protested. Never so much as a speeding ticket. Blanc's voice was cold now. He's lived here all his life, watching, waiting, making sure no one ever dredged up the past. Until a few weeks ago, when a bell ringer got too close to dying with a guilty conscience, and a historian opened the wrong book. The trap is set as the sky darkened, and the village prepared for yet another sleepless night. Benoit Blanc stood at the edge of Blackmere Lake, once again watching the water. Spoke aloud, quietly, as if to the shadows. You've left your messages. You've left your warnings, but now I leave one for you. He placed a small item on the stone by the unmarked grave. A blank envelope, sealed with red wax. Inside it, a note with just 3 words. I found her far behind him, in the woods. A figure stirred. The killer had read every message, except this one. But now, the game had changed, and so had the odds. Chapter 6. A visitor after midnight rain slicked. The windows of the Stag's whisper like melting candle wax. Inside, the pub had long since emptied, leaving only the hush of closing hours. Nina locked the front door and glanced once at the back window. Fog rising again, lake quiet creeping in. Upstairs, Benoit Blanc sat in his room with the envelope. Still warm from the candle wax seal, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He was waiting. He'd left the note. I found her at the stone grave by the lake just before sunset. It hadn't been seen yet, he guessed, but it would be. Someone was always watching, and that someone had killed twice. Now they would come. He'd just finished pouring a cup of tea when he heard it. A creak on the stairs, slow, measured, deliberate. Not the kind of sound a guest made. This was the sound of someone who didn't want to be heard, but couldn't help it. Blank stayed seated. Another creak. Then silence. Then gently the soft turn of a doorknob. Come in, Blank said calmly. Before the visitor could knock, the door opened. A tall, lean man entered, perhaps 50, with neatly combed hair, dark eyes, and a faint scar on his chin. His coat was still damp from the rain. He shut the door quietly behind him. Mr. Blank, he said, I assume you know who I am. Blank did not rise. Martin Linton, chair of the parish trust, son of Malcolm, and lately cleaner of old messes. Martin smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. That's quite a resume. You missed out murder, Blank said, softly. But I suppose that's still up for debate. Martin stepped closer, eyeing the teacup. May I? Please. Poisoning seems beneath you. Martin poured, sat opposite him. The 2 men stared at one another as thunder rumbled distantly beyond. The hills. You're not police, Martin said at last. No, Blank agreed. But you came anyway, which tells me you're not here to threaten me. Martin swirled the tea once. I came to correct your version of events before you publish it to the world. Blank tilted his head. And what version would you like me to believe? Martin leaned forward, elbows on his knees. That Eleanor Marsh was pregnant. That she and my father were foolish. But her death, that was never meant to happen. So it did happen. Martin hesitated. She fell. That's what they told me. She went to confront someone. Maybe my father, or the vicar. No one's ever told me who. But there was shouting. And then she fell. Down the embankment by the lake. And the baby? Martin looked away. She was already gone by then. So who buried her? Blank. Pressed. And why wasn't it reported? Martin's face darkened. Because my father thought he was saving everyone from scandal. Said it would destroy the church, the council, our name. So he and Worthing and Michael, Graham's father, they made it disappear. And Graham? Blank asked. He found the ledger. Came to me 2 nights ago. Said he wanted to take it to the papers. Said I had one chance to help him come forward or be exposed too. Blank waited. Martin met his eyes again. I told him I needed time to think. I didn't kill him, Mr. Blank. I swear. When I went to speak with him the next day, he was already gone. Blank studied him. And Mr. Worthing? He asked quietly. Martin blinked. That I don't know. But I'd wager someone got to him before Graham did. Maybe he panicked. Maybe he left a note. Maybe whoever killed Graham thought Worthing had said too much. Blank sat back. So you didn't kill them. But you covered for those who did. Martin's jaw clenched. I was trying to protect my father, his legacy. And in doing so, Blank said, you may have painted a target. On your own back. A visitor leaves Martin Linton, left quietly, blending back into the storm-soaked night. But he left behind more than damp footprints and cold tea. He left behind questions. Questions only the killer could truly answer. Blanc now knew the truth of Eleanor Marsh's death, the tragic tumble, the child, the silent burial. But what he didn't know was who had returned, decades later, to punish those who hid it. Someone else was out there. Someone with intimate knowledge of the past. Someone clever enough to use fear, folklore, and timing to disguise two murders as echoes of a 50-year-old crime. The shadow beneath the lake that night. Blanc returned to the lake. He stood once more at the water's edge, moonlight trembling on the surface. All was still, until a splash. He turned sharply. Something or someone had moved just beneath the surface, near the roots of the crooked tree. He knelt, scanning the shoreline. And there, stuck in the muck, was a child's toy, a rattle. An OILCLOTH. And scrawled on the cloth in old ink. She heard the truth. Now she sleeps in silence. Blanc stood slowly, heart pounding. This was not just revenge. This was a message to someone still alive, and someone young. Chapter 7. The girl in the red hoodie, Nellie Barnes, hadn't come home. That much was clear by morning. Her grandmother's cottage, tucked just off Maple Row, was quiet and undisturbed, but the old woman inside was pacing barefoot across the linoleum, eyes wide, hands shaking. The tea on the stove had long since boiled over. She went to the lake yesterday afternoon. She told Constable Rigby, voice hoarse with worry, said she was going to meet Mr. Blanc later. Said she had something to show him. Now her red hoodie was gone from its peg, and the notebook, the one she'd always carried, the one Blanc had told her to guard, was lying neatly folded on her pillow. That was the first warning. The second came just before noon. A note. Benoit Blanc stood in the vicarage hallway, turning the envelope over in his hands. It was wet. Not from the rain, but from condensation. It had been left on the vicarage doorstep, inside a sealed plastic bag, slid beneath the door without a sound. Inside, there was no message. Only a photo. A Polaroid. It showed a forest clearing near the lake. Just between the tree line and the shore. In the middle of it, tied to a tree, with her hands behind her back, was Nellie. Eyes closed. UNMOVING. And behind her, faint but unmistakable in the tree bark, a familiar carving, EM+. 1972 Elton, watching from behind, drew a trembling breath. That's the old trail, the one that leads to the ruins of the old marsh cottage. Blanc nodded slowly. It's where Eleanor once lived. And now, the Reverend whispered, they've brought her back there. The woods remember the path was half forgotten, half swallowed by creeping roots and thistle. It wound in a slow arc from the church's backfield to the northern shore of Blackmere, the side few people visited anymore. There was no picnic bench, no walking signs, no trail markers. Just time and silence. Blanc walked alone. Rigby had insisted on sending 2 constables ahead, but Blanc had waved them off. The killer expects an audience, he said, but he doesn't expect someone who listens in silence. The woods closed in overhead like a cathedral of shadows. Each step stirred the hush. And then, at the bend, the clearing, there she was. Nellie. Tied to a tree, gag in her mouth, eyes open now, wide, alert, afraid. She saw him, and behind her, on the ground, a figure stepped forward. Not masked, not cloaked. Just familiar. Blanc stopped cold. You, he said. I should have known. The true face it was Reverend Philip Elton. His collar gone, his face pale, sweaty, but his eyes, unblinking, burned with a calm, eerie resolve. You knew too much, he said softly. Both of you. And the girl was going to speak to the papers. Blanc didn't move. You were there in 1972, he said slowly. You weren't the vicar then, but you were here. You saw what happened. I did more than see, Elton said. I was part of it. I was the one who helped carry her. I was 19. A theology student. Malcolm told me it was for the good of the village, that Eleanor was going to destroy everything. He laughed softly, bitterly, and I believed him. Blanc's voice lowered. So you've lived all these years with the truth. I buried it, Elton snapped, with the rest of them. But then Worthing started whispering to the choir girls. Sadie wanted to confess. That's when I knew the silence was breaking. So you killed him. I helped him, Elton said. He was dying anyway. I gave him peace. Let him die in the bell tower, where he wanted to be. And Graham? Blanc asked. Elton's jaw tightened. Graham was going to expose all of it. His father, Malcolm, the cover-up. He found the ledger. I had to stop him. The lake. It remembers. And now so will the village. He pulled something from his coat. A small vial. Poison, he said. Quiet, effective. I used it on the dog first. A test. No one noticed. And Nellie? Blanc asked. Is this her punishment? She's the echo, Elton said. The girl Eleanor might have raised. Curious, bold, unafraid of questions. But this village doesn't survive people like that. He stepped forward. And that was when Nellie moved Dot in a burst of force and instinct. She kicked backward, hard, catching Elton off balance. The vial flew from his hand. Blanc stepped in, catching the man's wrist mid-swing, twisting just enough to bring him down to the forest floor. Dot. The Reverend went limp. Breathing hard. Dot. It was over. The return hours later, Nellie sat wrapped in blankets. On the vicarage steps, her face pale but unbroken. The notebook was in her lap again, fingers curled tightly around it. Blanc sat beside her. They'll ask what happened, she said. They'll ask a lot, he replied. She looked at him. Will they believe it? Blanc smiled faintly. They'll believe what they always do in villages like this, that some things are better left in the past. But we didn't, she whispered. No, he said. We didn't. She looked up at the sky, clouds moving off at last. I think I want to leave here someday, she said. See the world. You will, Blanc said softly. But you'll carry Marleycombe with you. Just not its silence. He stood, offering her his hand. Behind them, Blackmere Lake rippled once, gently, like an exhale, as if finally, after 50 years, it had let something go. Chapter 8. What the village chose to forget. The arrest of Reverend Philip Elton made the local paper, but only in the bottom corner, beneath a headline about the summer fair being postponed due to rain. The words were careful. Cleric questioned in connection with historic deaths. No mention of Eleanor Marsh. No mention of a girl tied to a tree. Just whispers printed in ink. But Marleycombe was already buzzing. The truth, as ever, moved faster. Through teacups and hedgerows than it did through official channels. By the following morning, Nina at the Stag's Whisper had heard everything, right down to the vial of poison and the rattle wrapped in oilcloth. People won't forget this one, she said as she served Blanc his final breakfast at the pub. Not like before. Blanc stirred his tea. They will, in time. That's what villages do best. They bury things in manors and window boxes. Nina gave him a long look. You're not staying then? No, he said gently. I go where I'm needed. And Marleycombe, for now, has been bled of its secrets. The trial that wasn't Elton was never formally charged with murder. The coroner ruled Worthing's death inconclusive, citing age and failing health. The death of Graham Linton was more difficult, but Elton's lawyer produced enough ambiguity to delay proceedings indefinitely. No fingerprints, No eyewitnesses. Just a Polaroid, a note, and a silence deep enough to drown in. Elton was remanded to a private care facility, deemed mentally unfit to stand trial. Some said it was mercy. Others said it was Marleycombe protecting its own. One last time. Nellie wasn't satisfied. He confessed, she said to Blanc during one of their final looks. To everything, Blanc nodded. But confession isn't always enough for punishment. In small towns, justice is a polite negotiation between truth and reputation. Nellie's jaw set. Then let me be impolite. He smiled at that. The memory beneath the lake, it was Nellie who returned to the lake weeks later, this time alone. Not with fear, but with purpose. She brought with her a single wooden cross, carved by hand. Just initials. M 1972. She planted it near the tree where Eleanor had once lived, just above the roots where her unmarked grave was hidden. She stayed. Until sunset. And when she turned to go, she thought, just for a moment, that she heard something behind her. Not a splash, not a voice, just a sigh. A long exhale from the lake that had swallowed so much. She did not look back. Blanc's letter. 3 weeks after he'd left, Nellie received a letter. Cream paper. Handwritten. Louisiana postmark. Dear Miss Barnes, there are few people I meet in this line of work who possess both curiosity and courage in equal measure. You do. You may not know it yet, but you cracked this case long before I did, not with evidence, but with insistence. You asked, and kept asking. That is how justice begins, not in a courtroom, but with a refusal to accept the easy story. I suspect this village will not always be your home. Good. Let it be your beginning, not your end. If ever you find yourself lost in a story again, write to me. I'll listen. Yours sincerely, Benoit Blanc. Nellie folded the letter, tucked it between the pages of her old notebook, and she opened to a new page and began to write again. And beneath it all, the lake remained. Blackmere. Still. Deep. Watching. People still walked past it, tossed stones, whispered stories to tourists. But once a year, on a moonless night, someone left a single white lily at the edge of the water. No name. No card. Just the flower. Floating. Drifting over a lake that once had no bottom, and now had a grave full of truth. Chapter 9. The stranger in the churchyard Markelbaum had begun to forget again. Not forget entirely, no, just enough to breathe without guilt, to smile in shop windows, to wave across hedges without flinching. The truth had not been erased, but gently folded and stored away in a drawer no one opened. Nellie Barnes returned to school. Her grandmother returned to gardening. The Reverend's empty vicarage was sealed shut, its windows gathering dust and ivy. Until the stranger arrived. He came one Tuesday morning, pale blue raincoat, polished shoes, and a wide-brimmed felt hat that didn't belong in any century this one remembered. He said little, walked slowly, and visited only one place. The churchyard. The name, it wasn't on any stone. Nellie saw him from the post office window. He stood by the far wall of the graveyard, where the stones grew mossy and slanted, and where the ground had begun to give way to wildflowers. He wasn't reading names. He was measuring silence. When he returned the next day, Nellie followed. He didn't look surprised when she approached. You're the girl who found the ledger, he said, not unkindly. And you're the man pretending not to care about graves, she replied. He chuckled softly. Touché. She waited. He nodded. Toward the corner of the yard. There's a plot missing. I grew up 2 villages over. I remember Eleanor Marsh's name whispered through fence posts. But I don't see her here. She was never buried here, Nellie said. Then where? He asked. Nellie tilted her head. Why do you want to know? The man gave her a long, measured look. Then he said simply, because she was my aunt. Aunt Eleanor's secret. They sat later under the sycamore in the square. The man, his name was Thomas Marsh, produced a letter worn from years of folding. I found this in my mother's belongings, he said. Written by Eleanor in 1971. It said if anything happened to her, someone in the village would try to cover it up. That she was in love, but afraid. That she wouldn't run. Not this time. Nellie listened, heart pounding. She was gone before I was born. Thomas sighed. No official record. No funeral. Nothing. But my mother never stopped looking. She believed Eleanor had died for speaking out. For falling in love with the wrong man. She did, Nellie said. And she paid for it. They sat in silence. Then Nellie said, Do you want to see where she rests? Thomas's eyes welled, but he nodded. The pilgrimage to the lake. It was dusk by the time they reached the gnarled tree, the handmade wooden cross still there, weather-worn but proud. A wild lily had grown beside it. This is where we believe. She was buried, Nellie said softly, without a stone, without a name, until now. Thomas stood without speaking for a long time. Then he reached into his coat and took out a pendant, a silver locket, scratched and dented. She wore this in every photo, he whispered. It's all I had of her. He knelt and placed it at the base of the cross. Then he said, almost too quietly to hear, Thank you for remembering her. Even when they didn't. A new story begins that night. Nellie wrote again. Her notebook was nearly full now, pages stained with rain, grief, discovery, and truth. But the last page wasn't about secrets or sorrow. It was about Eleanor. A village that tried to forget her, and a girl who didn't let them. As the candle flickered on her desk. Nellie titled the entry, The Lake with No Bottom, by Nellie Barnes. Outside, Blackmare was quiet again, but this time, not because it was hiding something. This time, because it had been heard. Chapter 10, The Return of Benoit Blanc, the postcard. Arrived with no return address. It was pressed between utility bills and a gardening catalog. Its edges sun-faded and smudged with postal ink. Nellie Barnes found it on the kitchen counter when she came home from school. A kettle still warm on the stove, and her grandmother humming a tune she hadn't hummed in years. She turned it over. Just 3 words. In a familiar looping hand. I need you. BBA note left at the Vicarage. Blanc's return to Marleycombe went unnoticed by most. There was no fanfare, no gathering at the Stag's Whisper, no grand proclamation of purpose. But the vicarage door, once sealed and silent, had been unlocked. Its curtains were drawn. A candle burned faintly in the study window. Nellie knocked once. Then twice. Blanc opened the door, wearing his signature body and a deeply furrowed brow. Come in, he said. I didn't want to involve you again, but I fear this mystery may already have chosen you. The unopened letter on the table lay a yellowing envelope, addressed in looping black ink, to Reverend Philip Elton, to be opened upon my death. The postmark was dated 5 months ago, 2 weeks before Worthing died in the bell tower. Blanc unfolded it carefully. Inside was a letter that made his hands still and his breath catch. Philip, I know what we did. I know where we buried her. But I also know we didn't act alone. There was someone else there that night. Not Malcolm, not you. Someone else who watched. They have kept quiet all this time. But I believe they are no longer content to stay in the shadows. If you are reading this, it means my silence failed to protect you. Be careful. The sins we buried did not die with her. T. Worthing. Blanc looked up. It seems Reverend Elton wasn't the only one carrying a secret. A hidden witness. There was someone else, Nellie murmured. Someone even Worthing feared? Not feared, Blanc said. Warned against. There's a difference. He turned to the fireplace, where the ashes had been recently disturbed. From the grate, he pulled a half-burned slip of paper, scrawled on it in frantic script, "Do not trust the teacher." Nellie froze. "But the teacher's dead." Blanc shook his head. "Walter Pym?" "Yes, but he had a brother, didn't he?" Nellie thought hard. "Matthew Pym, retired. Taught in London for years. Moved back recently. Quiet man, lives up near the woods. And never once involved himself in this village's scandals," Blanc said. "Until now." The midnight visitor that evening? Under a bruised violet sky, Blanc and Nellie made their way toward the cottage at the edge of Bracken Hollow. A half-hour walk past the lake. Matthew Pym lived alone. Rarely spoke. But according to parish records, he had been at the church the night of Eleanor's death, logged in the visitor book at 9:17 p.m., the exact hour her funeral was falsified. Blanc knocked gently. No answer. He tried the handle. Unlocked. Inside. The air was thick with pipe smoke and camphor. Books lined the walls. On the mantel, a faded photograph of Eleanor Marsh, smiling beside a teenage Matthew. Nellie stepped back. He loved her. Blanc nodded and watched her fall into ruin. Then they heard it. A soft creak upstairs. Someone was home. End of chapter 10. A door creaks. A figure waits above. A letter warns of someone watching. A teacher once silent may hold the final truth. Shall I continue with chapter 11, where the final hidden piece of the past is revealed, and a shocking confession changes everything Nellie thought she knew? Chapter 11. The teacher's confession. The stairs groaned with age as Benoit Blanc ascended, every footstep deliberate. Behind him, Nellie held her breath. She wasn't supposed to be here, not really, but something told her this chapter needed both of them. At the top, the hallway was dim. One closed door stood at the end. Blanc knocked once, then gently pushed it open. Inside sat Matthew Pym, wrapped in a blanket, a pipe extinguished in an ashtray beside him. His eyes, cloudy but not unkind, watched them with the wary calm of a man who had expected this visit for years. "I was wondering how long it would take," he said. "Come in, Mr. Blanc." Blanc entered without a word. Nellie followed. Matthew gestured to the chair across from him. "Eleanor, that's what you've come about." "I believe you know why," Blanc said softly. Matthew nodded. "The past has a way of clawing up through the floorboards, doesn't it? A love kept silent. She was brilliant," Matthew began, his voice rough with emotion. "Not just beautiful. She had fire. She wanted to change the way things were. The school, the council, the church. Too much for one village to tolerate." He looked down at his hands. "And yes, I loved her, quietly, from the back of a classroom. I was young, shy. She was in love with someone else, Malcolm Linton, though I never understood why." He looked up at Nellie. "You remind me of her," unafraid to ask dangerous questions. Nellie flushed, but held his gaze. "I was there that night," he continued. "She came to the church, pregnant, furious. She had found out that Malcolm had no intention of leaving his wife. She was going to speak. She had written a statement for the parish newsletter. I saw her give it to the vicar." Blanc leaned in. "To Reverend Cantwell?" Matthew nodded. "Yes, the original vicar. A coward. He never published it. Said it would ruin too many people. That night, there was an argument outside the vestry. I stayed hidden in the gallery. I saw Malcolm strike her." Nellie gasped. "She fell," Matthew said softly. "She hit her head on the stone. The blood was immediate, but she was still alive." "Barely." Blanc's voice was low. "Did you try to help her?" "I froze," Matthew admitted. "And then Malcolm called others. Worthing, Elton, even my brother, Walter. They carried her away like she was a broken crate. Said they'd take her to the lake. Let the village think she'd fled. And you said nothing, Blanc murmured. Matthew's eyes glistened. I was afraid. I was young. And when Walter died or was drowned, I knew silence was safer. The truth in the floorboards, Blanc stood and began to pace slowly. There was a letter, he said, written by Worthing, warning that someone else had seen everything, that someone had watched and kept quiet. That was you. Matthew nodded. And the recent murders? Blanc asked. Were you involved? No, Matthew said. I never meant for anyone to die. I simply began writing again. I thought if I left notes, if I stirred the memory, someone braver than me might bring it to light. Nellie stared. You're the one who sent the first message. The one about the lake remembering, he said quietly. Yes, but Elton killed Worthing, Nellie whispered. And Graham. I didn't know he would go that far, Matthew said. He'd buried the truth so deep, he panicked. Thought the sins were following him. Maybe they were. Blanc crossed to the mantel and lifted the old photograph of Eleanor. You kept her with you. Matthew smiled faintly. Every day. Blanc turned. Then you must come forward. You're the last living witness. Matthew sighed. Will they forgive me? Blanc looked at Nellie. She said softly, If they won't, I will. A statement given 2 days later. Matthew Pym gave a full statement to the authorities. Though no formal charges were brought, his confession helped close the official file on Eleanor Marsh. The death certificate was updated. The grave was marked her name, once a whisper, became part of the village's record again. The weight of silence lifted on a quiet morning. Nellie stood by the lake with Matthew at her side. Together, they placed a new stone, small, gray, but carved clearly. Eleanor Marsh, 1950 to 1972. She spoke. They silenced her. But now she has heard. Matthew placed his hand on the stone and wept. Nellie let him. And Benoit Blanc, standing a few steps away, tipped his hat to the wind. Chapter 12. The last ripple, the truth, once unearthed, doesn't settle neatly into place. It ripples, disturbs, lingers. In Marleycombe, the name Eleanor Marsh was no longer spoken in hushed tones. Her grave had a stone. Her story had been told, or at least the parts brave enough for daylight, but Blackmere Lake ever still remained. Restless, even in spring. The drowning that never was Benoit Blanc stood once more at the lakeside, his hands folded behind his back, watching as sunlight dappled the water like scattered coins. Nellie was beside him, holding the old parish ledger, the one Graham Linton had died for. They finished clearing out Reverend Elton's belongings, she said. The church wants to donate the books to the Historical Society. Blanc glanced at her. All the books? She hesitated. Well, almost. He raised an eyebrow. I may have borrowed something, she admitted, producing a faded cloth-bound diary. It was thin, torn at the corners, and labeled in ink. E.M. Private Blanc's face changed. Not surprise, something quieter. Respect. You found Eleanor's diary, he murmured. Nellie nodded. Hidden in the church, behind a hollow panel, wrapped in wax cloth. It's only a few pages, but... She handed it to him. Eleanor's final words. The pages were fragile, but the handwriting elegant, rushed, but deliberate. Blanc read aloud. They told me to run, to be quiet, to disappear. But silence is just another way of being buried. I will not go quietly into the dark. If they drown me, let it be where I once sang as a child. Let the lake hold me. Let it remember me. One day, someone will ask why there was no funeral, no birth certificate, no grave. And someone else will lie. But the water doesn't lie. The water remembers. Blanc closed the book slowly. She knew, he said softly. She knew what they'd do. And still she stayed. Nellie looked out at the water. She wasn't just brave. She was right. The final secret Blanc turned, suddenly thoughtful. "There's one more question," he said. "One thing I never quite believed." Nellie looked at him. "What?" "The child." She frowned. "They said it didn't survive. That she'd already miscarried." He nodded. "That's the official version." And yet, Eleanor wrote as though someone might ask why there was no birth certificate. Not why the child died, but why the child was never counted. Nellie's breath caught. "You think the baby lived?" Blanc didn't answer at first. Then he knelt beside the tree where Eleanor's grave lay. The grave was small, but not small enough for two. He looked up at Nellie. What if someone took the child? The woman with the yellow scarf. That afternoon, back in the square, they visited Margaret Veal one final time. She was sitting by the window, knitting, the yellow scarf trailing over her knees like sunlight. Blanc sat gently beside her. "Margaret," he said, "did Eleanor's child survive?" She didn't speak for a long time. Then, without looking up, she whispered, "Yes." Nellie gasped. "I lied because I was told to," Margaret said. "I told everyone the baby was stillborn." But she wasn't. Eleanor delivered early, quietly, alone with me. The baby was breathing, crying. What happened to her? Nellie asked. Margaret finally met her eyes. "I raised her sister's child. In secret. She was adopted by a family in the next county. No one ever knew, except the old vicar and Worthing. And me." She reached into a drawer and pulled out a photograph, a baby swaddled in cloth. Beside her, a name written in faded ink. Sarah Marsh. The lake gives one last answer. That evening, Nellie stood once more at the edge of the water, holding the diary in her hands. Eleanor's voice, old, defiant, kind, echoed in her mind. "I will not go quietly into the dark." The lake shimmered. And for once it felt still, not hiding, not clutching secrets. Just resting. Nellie tossed a single lily onto the surface. It drifted slowly outward, then paused, as though something beneath held it in place for a moment, then gently released. A final blessing, a final goodbye. Chapter 13. Sarah Marsh for years. Sarah Marsh had known there was something unspoken in her past. She couldn't name it, couldn't pin it to a date or a moment, just a persistent ache, as if a page had been torn out of the first chapter of her life. She was raised in Devon by loving, quiet parents who never quite explained how she'd come to them. They told her stories, yes, but they were careful stories, polished at the edges. She didn't push. Not until the letter arrived. A letter with no stamp. It had no return address, no postage. Just her name, written in an elegant, careful script. Sarah Marsh, private and personal. Inside was a single sentence. "Your mother died in silence, but her voice lives by the lake." And beneath it, a photograph, yellowed, faded, but unmistakable. Young woman with sharp eyes and a wide, determined smile. Her hair pulled back. A single pendant around her neck. Sarah stared at the picture for hours. Then she packed a bag and boarded a train to Marleycombe. The first meeting when Sarah arrived. In the village, the air was thick with rain and late autumn fog. She stepped onto the platform alone, her scarf tucked tight, her eyes scanning the surroundings like someone chasing a memory she'd never made. She didn't know what she was looking for, but Nellie Barnes did. "I thought you might come," Nellie said, standing beside the crumbling signpost that read Marleycombe Station. Sarah blinked. "You're the one who sent the letter?" Nellie hesitated. "No, but I knew who would." She handed Sarah a second envelope, this one sealed in wax, with the initials M. "Your mother wrote this," Nellie said, 52 years ago. She left it with someone who promised to give it to you, if you ever came looking. Sarah's hands shook as she opened it. Eleanor's letter to her daughter. To my child, I don't know if I'll ever hold you again. I don't know if I'll live to tell you that you are not born of shame, but of love. I was young and foolish, and I loved someone who could not love me freely. That cost me everything, but know this. Your voice is your inheritance. Use it. Speak when others do not. Write your story, even if they burn the pages. Because that is what I would have done if they'd let me live. Eleanor Sarah wept openly. The fog around her seemed to part, as though the lake itself was listening. It returned to the grave Nellie, led her to the tree by the lake. The new headstone stood quiet in the grass. Sarah dropped to her knees and touched. The name carved there, her mother's name. I never even knew, she whispered. Blanc, watching from a short distance, stepped forward only when she was ready. You're not just her daughter, he said gently. You're her voice. And Marleycombe has waited half a century to hear it. Sarah stood, wiped her tears. Then I suppose it's time someone told the truth properly. A new book begins. Weeks passed. Sarah stayed Dutch. She visited Margaret Veal. She read the parish ledgers. She sat by the lake, hour after hour, writing longhand in a weathered notebook. She carried everywhere. The villagers watched her warily at first. Then curiously. Then kindly. Nellie once found her in the Stag's Whisper, reading aloud to 3 school children, a story of bravery, of water, of silence broken. She wasn't just reclaiming her mother's name. She was reclaiming Eleanor's place in the village. The echo of footsteps one evening, after the first snow dusted the lakeside, Nellie and Sarah walked together by the water. I still wonder. Sarah said, how many people kept silent because they were afraid, and how many because they were guilty? Nellie nodded. Both, probably. Sarah looked at her. Do you think it's really over? Nellie hesitated. I think the lake gave up most of its secrets. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Most? Nellie smiled faintly. Let's just say, she whispered, in Marleycombe, the past never quite stays buried. Chapter 14. The Man with the Silver Cane. The snow didn't last long in Marleycombe. By morning, only thin frost curled along. The hedgerows in the lake had turned to glass, mirroring the gray sky above. Sarah Marsh sat at the corner table in the Stag's Whisper, her mother's diary spread before her, a pot of weak tea growing cold. Beside her elbow. She was sketching a timeline. Names, places, gaps. There were still so many gaps. That's when she saw him, a man she didn't recognize. Old, straight-backed, tightly gloved hands wrapped around a silver-tipped cane. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, brushing the frost from his shoulders, then made his way slowly toward her table. His voice was soft but clipped. You are Sarah Marsh, yes? She straightened, cautious. Yes? Who are you? He smiled. I suppose you could say, I'm someone your mother trusted once, and someone your father feared. A name from the past. The man introduced himself as Benedict Linton. Sarah stared. Linton? She repeated. As in Malcolm Linton? His brother, Benedict said. You've heard of him, I imagine. Sarah's mouth went dry. He's my father. Benedict's expression didn't change. That's what they say. He pulled a photograph from his coat, a photo Sarah had never seen. Eleanor, smiling, and beside her, a man who looked just like Benedict, but younger, his hand resting gently, protectively on her shoulder. That's not Malcolm, Sarah whispered. No, Benedict said. That's me. The truth he'd hidden. I loved her, Benedict said, before my brother ever did. But Malcolm was the golden son, the one the village loved, the one father bankrolled and protected. I was the quiet one, the disappointment. He looked away. When Eleanor became pregnant, she told everyone it was Malcolm's. Maybe she even believed it herself. But I knew. I'd been there. I remember the nights, the poems, the walks by the lake. Sarah's heart thudded. Are you saying? She was carrying my child, Benedict said. And I never had the courage to fight for her. He swallowed hard, so I disappeared, moved to Cornwall, kept out of Marley Combs' gossip. But I watched, quietly. And when she died, when they murdered her, I knew I had failed both of you. The ledger's missing page. I've brought you something else, he said, reaching into his coat again. It was a page old, torn from the original church ledger, yellowed with time and frayed at the edges. On it was a single name, Sarah Eleanor, Marsh born, the 17th of March, 1972, baptized in secret. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. This was hidden, Benedict said. Filed under an alias. Worthing must have helped. Eleanor wanted you to have a name, even if no one else knew. He looked at her, those tired, regretful eyes. You have a right to every piece of her, and to the truth that no one else dared speak. Benoit Blanc weighs the claim later that day. In the firelit quiet of the vicarage study, Benoit Blanc turned the page over in his hand. So, he said slowly, Sarah Marsh might not be Malcolm Linton's daughter after all. She's not, Sarah said with quiet certainty. She's Benedict's. He was with her. The dates line up, and look at the handwriting on this ledger page. It matches the baptismal book Walter Pym kept locked in the vestry. Blanc nodded. That ledger is the last remaining piece of this village's lie. Then he looked up. Are you ready to let it go? Sarah frowned. You mean forgive it? No, he said. Finish it. A choice beneath the ash tree that evening. They returned to the lake once more. Sarah stood by Eleanor's grave, the photograph and ledger page in her hand. The air was cold, but still. I could take this public, she said. Tell the world. Write the book. Name the names. You could, Blanc agreed. But maybe the truth, she continued, isn't just about exposure. Maybe it's about closure. She knelt and tucked the page beneath the wooden cross, pressing it gently into the soil. Then, after a long silence, she whispered, You were never alone, Mom. You just ran out of time. Behind her, the water didn't ripple. Not a sound disturbed the clearing. Chapter 15. A letter without a name. Truth had begun to settle in Marley Combe. Eleanor's grave was no longer hidden. Her story had been spoken aloud, in homes, in whispers, and finally in the village. Paper, or Sarah Marsh's essay, My Mother and the Lake That Remembered, appeared on the front page. Just beneath the fold, quiet, respectful. People read it in silence. No letters to the editor, no outcry. Just recognition. But not everyone was content to leave the past in peace. An envelope on the lectern the village library had never been so. Full. Sarah was due to give a reading, her first public event in the newly restored community hall. Nellie waited beside her with a stack of notes. Margaret Veal had come early and sat proudly in the front row. Even Benedict Linton stood at the back, eyes lowered, cane between his gloved hands. Just before Sarah took the lectern, a staff member handed her an envelope. No stamp, no return name. Just a single line on the front. Read this after. She tucked it under her notebook, breath unsteady, then looked up at the crowd. And began to speak. The first time her voice broke. Sarah's voice was steady as she read. She spoke not just of Eleanor's death, but her life. Her wit, her defiance, her laughter, the face of small-minded cruelty. Of how Eleanor had once stood at this very lake and said, If you ever go missing, make sure someone remembers you out loud. When she finished, there was a long charged silence, and applause, not polite, scattered clapping. but real warm applause that swelled from every corner of the room. Sarah smiled, blinking fast, and remembered the envelope, the hand that had not been counted back in her cottage that night. With the fire hissing low, Sarah finally opened the letter. Paper was old, soft as worn linen. Typed on a manual machine, the ink slightly uneven. The message was short. You've told your mother's story well, but there's something you still don't know. There were 4 men at the lake the night she died. Not 3. The 4th man still lives in Marley Coombe. He has watched everything you've done, and he is not finished. Beneath the message, a symbol, a bell, hand-drawn in black ink, and beside it 3 letters. CVF. Sarah stared at it, her chest tightening. She read it again, then again, and suddenly the room felt cold, despite the fire. The sound of the bell the next morning, Nellie found Sarah pacing along the lake path. The letter clenched in her hand. She showed it to her without a word. Nellie read it and looked up. CVF, she whispered. What does that mean? Sarah shook her head. I don't know. But the bell could be the church, Nellie. Sod. Could be Worthing. But he's dead, Sarah said. Which means someone else is still ringing the bell. Blanc arrived minutes later, having been summoned by a single line from Sarah's hurried note. They say there were 4. He read the letter in silence, then looked out across the lake. I thought the ripples had stopped, he said quietly. I was wrong. A name beneath the stone that evening. Benedict Linton returned to Eleanor's grave alone. He lit a small candle and tucked a folded paper beneath the headstone. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, his cane tapping softly over the frost dot behind him. Wind stirred the water again. Dot just once. A single ripple, like a heartbeat or a warning. Chapter 16. The 4th man's no returned to Marleycombe. With sudden force, silencing the village beneath a blanket of white. The lake froze at its edges. The trees crackled in the wind. And in the vicarage, Benoit Blanc placed the letter, the warning, under a magnifying glass. Sarah Marsh stood nearby, arms folded, face pale but set like stone. 3 men, she said. We've accounted for them. Malcolm Linton, Worthing, Elton. But this letter says there was a 4th. Blanc gave a small nod, eyes fixed on the strange symbol, the bell, and those 3 letters. CV. Do you recognize them? She asked. Not yet, he murmured. But they're not random. Whoever sent this wanted you to look closer. The vicarage's old legionelli arrived with the church's archival register, thick with crumbling pages, the spine held together by tape and prayer. She laid it gently on the table, flipped past the familiar names, and paused at an entry dated March 1972. It listed the witnesses present at a midnight service. C.V. Farnley. Assistant Sexton Blanc tapped the page slowly. There's our ghost, Nellie blinked. Farnley? I don't remember that name. Sarah shook her head. It's never come up. Blanc leaned back. Because he disappeared. Slipped out of the narrative like a whisper. Not mentioned. In any report. Not interviewed. But he was there. Nellie's eyes widened. What if Farlow was the first to know what happened to Eleanor, and the last to keep it secret? The sexton's Cotag-Maley-Cum's sexton's cottage sat abandoned near the edge of Ashen Row, a crook structure half swallowed by ivy and decades of wind. Most villagers thought it had collapsed long ago, but when Sarah, Nellie, and Blanc arrived, they found the lock recently changed. Inside, the air was cold and still. The fireplace was swept. A teacup rested clean in the sink. Someone had been living here. Or hiding. Sarah moved toward the mantel, where a cracked photo frame held an image of a man in his 40s, balding, wiry. His eyes were dark and unreadable. Cyril Vernon Farnley. Blanc read aloud. The missing 4th. The hidden confession. Behind a loose board in the floor, Nellie found a notebook, bound in dark green leather. Pages upon pages of tight handwriting. March 17th, 1972, I was at the church. I saw Eleanor. She was crying. She begged Malcolm to claim the child. He wouldn't. The others came. Worthing, Elton. Linton stayed back. He was drunk, useless. But I saw what happened when she fell. I saw Elton panic. And I saw Reverend Cantwell, yes, even him, order them to cover it up. I kept their secrets. For years. Because they paid me. Because I was afraid. But now, Eleanor's daughter has returned. She will ask. She will find me. And I will tell her the truth. Unless they get to me first. Sarah's throat tightened. He knew they were watching him. Blanc stared at the final page. If I vanish, look to the lake. The bell tower was never the only place where lies were buried. There. Bell tower revisited night fell fast, and the cold deepened as they climbed the steps of the old bell tower for the second time, the very place where Worthing had died. Sarah's boots echoed on the wooden stairs. Wind crept through the broken panes. The bell above swayed gently. Despite the still air. Blanc ran his hand along the inner wall, pressing gently. A hollow sound. He knocked again, then reached into the panel and pulled free a small wooden box, wrapped in oilcloth and dusted with decades of ash. Inside, a silver key, a letter, and a photograph of Eleanor, visibly pregnant, holding a baby's bonnet. The letter was addressed to Eleanor's child. The letter's final truth. I kept this from them because I couldn't bear what they planned next. After they buried Eleanor, they wanted to bury the child too, but someone stopped them. He took the baby, protected her, lied to everyone. Even me. He was not a monster, though he lived among them. If you are reading this, your name is Sarah, and the man you know is Benedict. He wasn't just your mother's love. He was your savior. Blanc exhaled. Benedict Linton took the child, he said. He saved her from the others. Lied about paternity. Hid her where no one would think to look. Sarah felt the letter tremble in her hands. He's not my father, she whispered, but he's the reason I'm alive. The lake breathes again the next day. They returned to the lake. The ice had begun to crack at the edges. The village stirred with rumors again, but they did not matter. Sarah placed the final letter in a tin box and buried it beside the grave. Not for secrecy, but for memory. Let the truth rest, she said quietly, but let it never be forgotten. Wind blew soft across the surface. The water didn't stir. And Benoit Blanc, standing beneath the naked ash tree, knew that for the first time since 1972, Marleycombe was no longer hiding anything. Not under the floorboards, not behind church pews, not even in the lake. Chapter 17. The envelope at the inn. Benoit Blanc never intended to stay in Marleycombe long. He had come to observe, to listen, to help a quiet grief find its voice. And now that it had, the threads seemed neatly tied. Eleanor's story told, Sarah's truth uncovered, the guilty dead, and the innocent remembered. His bags were packed, his coat buttoned. The vicarage was once again dark, but as he stepped into the lobby of the Marleycombe Inn, ready to request a car to the station, the innkeeper called out from behind the desk, "Mr. Blanc, something came for you." A plain envelope, hand-delivered. No stamp, no return address, only his name. Inside, a single slip of paper. No greeting, no farewell. Just 4 words. You missed one. E. Who was E? Blanc sat alone in the breakfast room, turning the note over in his fingers. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Neither Eleanor's, nor Elton's, nor Worthing's. Not Farnley's either. And yet, the message had a strange intimacy. A confidence. He folded it once, twice. And asked the question aloud. What did I miss? Sarah's new direction meanwhile. Across the village green, Sarah was rolling up poster paper in the back room of the Marleycombe Library. Next week, she would begin her writing workshops, open to anyone with a story, buried or burning. The first session was already full. Margaret Veal had signed up. So had 3 teenagers. Even a nervous-looking Mrs. Braithwaite, who'd spent 40 years pretending her husband's will, had no secrets. And Sarah? She had found something solid in the wreckage. Not just the truth, purpose. Still, something about Blanc's expression the day before had unsettled her. He had not looked finished. He had looked haunted. Back to the church that evening, as the last of the snow melted into puddles along the path, out on the edge of the moors, past the last cottages and telephone wires, a crooked lane led to a tin-roofed house, hunched between 2 trees. Like a secret trying to bury itself, no one answered the door. But the chimney was warm. The windows glowed with low amber light. Blanc found the door unlocked. He stepped inside. The house was small, sparse, books mostly, old maps, dozens of old photographs, some of Eleanor, some of Sarah, a wall covered in clippings, pinned and yellowed, everyone related to the church, the lake, or the deaths. And on the desk, a diary. Not Eleanor's, Edward's, the brother in the shadows. Blanc opened the first page. August 17th, 1971. I did not die. Worthing found me bleeding, yes, but he saw an opportunity. One less marsh to speak. He told the village I fell and broke my neck. But he didn't check twice. He didn't notice that. I woke. I left Marleycombe that night. Walked 10 miles through the forest. Earned my old papers. Became someone else. I returned 2 years later. As George Everett. I stayed quiet. Watched. Waited. Not for revenge. For justice. But justice never came. So I left pieces. Letters. Photos. I needed someone to follow the breadcrumbs. I needed. Sarah. Blanc turned another page. She has her mother's fire. And more. I see it in how she asks questions, even when it hurts. When I knew she was ready, I sent the first letter. This village buried the truth. But now, truth has hands. And a voice. The final confession in a box. Beside the desk sat a cassette. Tape. Blanc placed it in the recorder. The voice that emerged was quiet, aged and unmistakably broken. My name is Edward Marsh. If this is found, I am likely dead at last. I stayed, alive to make sure Eleanor was never lost. And to make sure they were. He paused. They drowned her. But they could not drown what she left behind. If you are Sarah, forgive me for staying in the shadows. I feared that if I came too close, I'd be hunted like she was. But I never stopped watching. And I never stopped loving you. A lantern for the lake that evening, Sarah, and Blanc returned to the water's edge. He handed her the diary and cassette. Said nothing. She sat for a long time, reading, listening, eyes closed against the wind. When she stood, she held the lantern Nellie had given her, an old brass thing, restored from the church. She lit it. Set it on the water. And watched it drift. It flickered, then steadied, then vanished into the dark. Chapter 19. The Memorial. Without a name, week passed before the village was ready. There had never been a memorial for Edward Marsh. To most of Marleycombe, he had died 54 years ago in a fall no one remembered. To others, he had simply never existed. But now, thanks to his journals, his voice, and the slow, quiet persistence of truth, the village finally understood. The man they called George. Everett had been there all along, watching, remembering, guarding. His sister's story like a flame cupped in both hands. Sarah stood at the pulpit in the old church, the same place where her mother had once been betrayed and tried to speak. But for once, words failed her. A ceremony of silence. The pews were full. Not from curiosity, but from something deeper. Recognition. Maybe even remorse. Blanc sat at the rear, quiet as ever. Margaret Veal held a candle. Even Benedict Linton, cane and all, made the slow walk to the front and placed a small notebook on. The altar, a ledger from the church archives, one he had stolen decades ago, and now returned. Sarah stepped back from the lectern and let Nellie read instead. He never asked for thanks. Nellie said softly. He never told a soul who he was. But without Edward Marsh, this village might have stayed broken forever. Blanc's final visit that afternoon, Benoit Blanc visited the small plot they had dug behind the church. There was no body, only a marker. A stone laid in the soil with a simple inscription. Edward Marsh, 1944. Truth sleeps, but never dies. Blanc placed a single brass button at the base of the stone, the kind Eleanor used to wear. Then he turned to Sarah, who stood behind him, her coat flapping in the wind. I believe he waited for you, Blanc said. Sarah nodded, brushing a tear from her cheek. And now I wonder, what am I supposed to do with all of it? To publish or to protect back in the vicarage, Sarah held three things: her manuscript, Edward's diary, and a letter from a London publisher who had read her article and wanted the full story. A book, a documentary, maybe even film rights. Could tell the world everything, she whispered to Blanc. About the murder, the church, the men who lied. You could, he agreed, but would it bring justice or just more pain? Blanc didn't answer. He poured tea instead. Then finally said, you must choose what kind of truth you believe in. The kind that punishes, or the kind that heals. A quiet answer the next morning. Sarah mailed the manuscript, but not to the publisher. To a history trust in Devon, with instructions. The story may be archived, but not published publicly until every person directly involved was gone, she included. One request, let the truth rest, not hidden, not erased, but resting like the lake, still, deep, and finally at peace. Blanc departs Marleycombe Beat, the station platform. Sarah stood beside Blanc as the train pulled in. Thank you, she said. For what? For never rushing the answer. For knowing it wasn't just a puzzle to be solved. Blanc smiled faintly. The best mysteries never are. He stepped aboard. The whistle blew as the train rolled forward. Sarah turned back toward the village, toward Marleycombe and the lake, and the stories that would always live beneath its still waters. Chapter 20. The lake that watched spring came early, too. Marleycombe. The frost lifted. Daffodils pushed through the softened earth. The air changed, not just in weather, but in spirit. The village, once cloaked in silence and suspicion, felt newly alive. The lake remained still, but it was no longer the kind of stillness born from secrets. It was the kind that follows a long sigh, when truth has been spoken and the earth allowed to settle again. Sarah Marsh stood on the path above the water, her notebook under one arm, a sealed envelope in her hand. It was addressed to no one, meant for no one, and yet meant for everyone. The final letter. She knelt beneath the ash tree, Eleanor's tree, and pressed the envelope into the roots. Inside, it were just three things: a copy of her article, the lake that watched, a photograph of Eleanor smiling in the sun, and a single line, handwritten in her mother's old fountain pen. I lived. I loved. I was not erased. Marleycombe moves forward. Nellie reopened the bakery. Benedict Linton quietly sold his family's estate and donated the proceeds to the church's restoration fund, anonymously, of course. Though everyone knew. Margaret Veal started attending Sarah's weekly writing circle. Her stories were strange, poetic, sometimes a little sharp around the edges. Children played near the lake again, Swings were rebuilt. The old bench was repainted. And though the villagers never forgot what happened there, they no longer feared it. The lake had changed. Or maybe they had. A stranger arrives 1 month later on a fog-slicked morning. A stranger stepped off the train at Marleycombe Station. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and carried a battered satchel. Her coat was old and travel-worn. She asked for directions to the church. Doing some research? The station master asked. She smiled. No, family business. Her name, signed in the guest ledger at the Stag's Whisper that afternoon, read Elizabeth. Marsh Everett genealogy. Private Inquirinelli raised an eyebrow when she saw it, but said nothing. The lake never forgets. That night, the woman stood at the edge of the lake, just as Sarah once had, just as Eleanor must have. She placed a candle on the water, watched it drift. Behind her, no footsteps, no wind, just silence. And far beneath the water, too deep to be seen, too. Old to be feared, something ancient and unspoken, let go. The final ripple past. And Marleycombe, at last, belonged to itself again.